Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us here this afternoon at the Ronald Reagan Institute. I'm Roger Zak, I'm the director, and the Institute carries the legacy of the 40th president here in our nation's capital, and we're honored to host this important event as part of our Center for Peace Through Strength's National Security on Innovation-based program. And the NSIB, as we refer to it, because everybody needs to have an acronym, the National Security Innovation-based program, it's a mouthful, is dedicated to assessing the health and effectiveness of America's national security innovation ecosystem. And earlier this year, we published the first ever report card to measure the NSIB's resilience and provided recommendations for improvement. Copies of our NSIB report card are outside for those here in the room. And for those online, you can access the report card online at reaganfoundation.org/NSIB. You're now allowed to pull out your Google machine and quickly get that, just for this one moment. We are proud to have Palantir Technologies serve as the Reagan Institute's innovation partner and are grateful for their contributions to our work on the National Security Innovation Base. In the 21st century, maintaining our global technological edge is crucial, especially in the face of China's growing assertiveness. This has almost become cliche. But we heard it yesterday from President Biden's address at the United Nations General Assembly and from President Zelensky's recent address reporting on the battlefield in Ukraine. The focus of today's discussions will be on data-driven technologies like artificial intelligence and importantly, their integration into national defense. And we've gathered an esteemed panel of experts, including Dr. Karlin, Mr. David Spirk, who will engage in a thoughtful discussion moderated by Josh Rogin from the Washington Post. You'll note Congressman Mike Waltz will not be here for the panel, though he was scheduled to. And it won't surprise you the reason why he's not here. He's on the Capitol working on keeping our government going. And we are hopeful that he succeeds in realizing a continuing resolution. So he gets a pass, but our panelists here do not. They will explore how these technologies can enhance military capabilities, inform policy development, and importantly, drive technological advancement. Now, the national conversation on AI has emerged this past year, calls to mind for us here at the Reagan Institute something President Reagan said in his March 23, 1983 speech when he announced the Strategic Defense Initiative 40 years ago. This is what he said, quote, "Free people must voluntarily, through open debate and democratic means, meet the challenge that totalitarians pose by compulsion. It's up to us, in our time, to choose, and choose wisely, between the hard but necessary task of preserving peace and freedom and the temptation to ignore our duty and blindly hope for the best while the enemies of freedom grow stronger day by day." Close quote. In our conversation today, we will take up President Reagan's charge. Each of our panelists, in their own way, is doing the hard work needed to meet the technological challenge our adversary poses. Indeed, the stakes are high, and we are grateful for your service. So now, please join me in welcoming our panel to the stage.
Thanks, everybody, for coming today, and thanks, Roger, for that excellent introduction. My name is Josh Rogin. I'm with the Washington Post. I'm really honored to have such a distinguished panel to talk about this important issue here today. I was going to ask Congressman Waltz whether Congress and the administration are functional enough to tackle tough issues, but I guess that question has been overtaken by events. Nevertheless, more time for the panelists who are here, and I think it's a really good opportunity to talk about this thing called AI in the context of national defense, which we all know is changing everything, but we're not exactly sure how, and we're not exactly sure where we are on it. I think for the purposes of our panel discussion, it might be productive to divide this into first the opportunities, and then the vulnerabilities. Then we'll get to your questions, start thinking about them now. And let me start with you, Dr. Karlin, by asking sort of an open question, which is, we see a lot in our strategy documents about the importance of organizing around this new group of technologies that we roughly call artificial intelligence. But we don't really have a good sense of where we are, how we're doing. So if you could sort of start by telling us, based on what we've seen in the open source of what our objectives are, how far are we along? What are the things that you can point to as concrete accomplishments so far, and what are the biggest challenges going forward?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Josh. It's a real pleasure to be here on this lovely afternoon with you all. So hopefully everyone here has spent time with the National Defense Strategy. If not, I implore you to do so. It came out last year, and the National Defense Strategy is pretty clear and pretty punchy in terms of its prioritization. It really focuses on the People's Republic of China as the pacing challenge and the need to sustain and strengthen deterrence. And it emphasizes this notion of building enduring advantage, which I think is really relevant to the conversation we're having today, right? How do you make sure that you are harnessing innovation? How are you harnessing American ingenuity, which we have seen, of course, from time immemorial in our country, so as to ensure that today the security environment looks good and also tomorrow it does as well? We are seeing emerging technology, including artificial intelligence, enabled tools already reshaping the world in any number of ways, seemingly more so each day. And that's really why we saw in our National Defense Strategy this emphasis on accelerating innovation and adoption. I thought, Josh, maybe I'll just talk about 3 ways that we're actually doing these things, and then I suspect we'll have a lot more to talk about. So first, we are investing in cutting-edge technologies. If you read the FY24 budget, it actually contains an unprecedented level of funding for research and development and for procurement. $145 billion for R&D and $170 billion for procurement. That's a huge percentage of a budget that would be $842 billion. And I would note our largest commitment ever in these areas. And through this, we're trying to invest in a whole bunch of spots of advanced technologies, from directed energy to hypersonics, integrated sensing, cyber, clean energy technology, whole bunch of areas. And that's really kind of the story of the U.S. military, right? Our own combat credible force. We're also leveraging the capabilities of our allies and partners. AUKUS is a great example here, and I suspect we can talk more about that in the Q&A. So point number 1 is we're investing in cutting-edge capabilities and cutting-edge technologies. Point number 2 is we're bringing emerging capabilities to fruition. We're not just saying, hey, in the future, we're going to spend the money and go do these things. We're actually making it a reality as well. So a couple of years ago, we announced the Rapid Defense Experimentation Reserve, RAIDER. And the idea here is get these promising prototypes into the hands of our warfighters as quickly as possible. And so we've had a bunch of experimentation. I think it's something like $700 million or so that's pitched for the next fiscal year to really focus on those key challenges that we saw while we were building the National Defense Strategy, including making sure that our forces have timely and accurate information. AI is obviously going to be critical to all of that. It's important to ensure for that emerging technology really to come to fruition, for us to ensure that we've got institutional reforms as well, right? So making sure our processes are designed to move quickly. That's probably not always the case for a whole bunch of good reasons, but we want to make sure that it is to the extent possible. So really fast track our fielding of things like AI and autonomy, for example. You all probably saw our Deputy Secretary of Defense recently announce this Replicator initiative. And what this is trying to do is leverage existing programs so that we can field all domain attritable autonomous systems within the next 1.5 to 2 years, right? It's a real challenge to say we've got to find a way to do this as quickly as possible, knowing that a lot of this technology is already out there. So that's the second piece. Let me just hit this third piece, which is global AI norms. And the United States really is trying to be a leader in global artificial intelligence norms. Look, we all know that these sorts of technology in the hands of authoritarians looks very different, right? Authoritarians, rogue states, strategic competitors. If not properly addressed, that actually could erode the balance of power and could play a role in deterrence and even in conflict as well. So we've been trying really hard to lead the way in governing the responsible development and use of these technologies. And there's a bunch of examples here. One I would just point out is that in January we updated Department of Defense Directive 3000.09, Autonomy in Weapon Systems. This might sound like a very wonky process thing, but let me tell you, it actually isn't. It's actually a really, really big deal. So in 2012, we published this directive, which is really the first thing out there about how we understand autonomy in weapon systems. And now a decade or so later, we've updated, recognizing the security landscape has changed and the technology landscape has changed as well. We've had a couple more examples. In 2020, we released our AI ethical principles. We released our responsible AI strategy and implementation pathway. And just about maybe 5-6 months or so ago, we introduced a political declaration on responsible military use of artificial intelligence and autonomy. And what you're seeing here effectively is a confluence of efforts to try to emphasize the need to act responsibly in this space. So with that, let me wrap and turn it back to you.
Sure, excellent. Thank you for that rundown. Before I move on to David, let me just focus on that last piece, the international norms.
Yes.
And I realize that, in a sense, this may not be in the DoD's lane, that this is kind of, but since you brought it up, it seems like the list of things that you mentioned are all, mostly anyway, unilateral steps that the United States has taken. And I'm wondering, in the effort to engage not just partners and allies, but also potential competitors or adversaries, what have you gotten back? What do you see on the other side? Is there really an appetite, a forum, the spark of a real conversation? Or right now, does it seem that really that we're charting down that path largely on our own?
So the good news is, rarely does the United States do things on our own, right? We have an unparalleled network of allies and partners, a network that when you look at countries, say Russia or the People's Republic of China, nowhere near a comparison. And so, for example, the political declaration that I highlighted was actually released in Europe. We have a number of Europeans who are interested and involved in it as well. So we're working on building, if you will, coalitions of enthusiasm on this to try to outline that there is a need for a responsible approach. And to the extent that strategic competitors want to have conversations on these issue sets, I think we would be willing and interested in doing so. To the extent that they don't, we will make sure to be a model of what right looks like.
Got it. Coalitions of enthusiasm. I haven't heard that before. I like that. I'm going to steal that for sure.
Please do. It's a gift.
I guess you've seen the calls, and again, I realize this is not specifically a DoD issue, but since you're here on behalf of the administration, you've seen the calls, including many in Congress, coming from many in Congress, for new regulatory government authority or even a new government agency to make the rules and enforce the rules of the road on AI. Is that something the administration supports at this stage? Is that something that DoD is actively exploring?
I wouldn't want to speak for the administration. I would say, though, whenever you conduct organizational changes, and I've lived through a number of them inside government, I suspect many folks here as well, in either the government or private sector, you're always going to create new challenges, right? New opportunities and new challenges. And you've got to do a cost-benefit analysis to figure out what makes the most sense. I would really want to ensure that whatever changes happen, we ensure that folks across the entire government understand that investing in AI and responsible AI principles is actually the mandate of all of us, not just a small subset.
Understood. Thank you. David, you're here on behalf of Palantir, but before that you spent, 27 years as an operator, as a top intelligence official, a top military official. And so the question I wanted to ask you most was, what are you seeing in terms of how AI has already changed the battlefield? We'll get to the corporate stuff in a minute, but there's a war going on in Ukraine. It's very clear that AI is being used in ways that even the U.S. military could not have anticipated before this war started. So based on all of that experience, what are we learning about the way that AI is changing warfighting right now?
Yeah, so I think the advantage of AI is speed and proficiency. A byproduct is efficiency. What I can tell you is I actually was at U.S. Central Command headquarters 2 days ago. And General Carrillo was looking at his current Digital Falcon Oasis exercise, They were looking at the global information dominance experiment, which I think number 7 is about to kick off, and they were preparing for that. And at the end of the session, as J3 said, Dave, you used to be the DJ2 here. What did you see? Do you want to talk to the team? And I told them they're cheating. When I was the DJ2, it was about 10 years ago, and we didn't have any of this capability. We were using spreadsheets and SharePoint folders and picking up the phone and maps, and you never knew which way it was coming, which way it was going. This was always the dream. We always knew we wanted to use data-driven technologies in new and profound ways that allowed us to be more proficient and efficient in our jobs, whether that was at a combatant command headquarters or down in the field, at a tactical element. The challenge is we didn't have the compute, the transport, or the data-driven software capability to realize those things. We had kind of pieces and parts. About 7 years ago now, I guess it is 2023, so 7 years ago, Lieutenant General Shanahan and Colonel Drew Kukor arrived with a task from Congress to do a study on the use of artificial intelligence in the Defense Intelligence Enterprise. They were both in USDINS at the time. They decided they weren't going to do a study. They were going to do a program. They were going to do a project. And we were going to begin to build computer vision capabilities to see if we could integrate them into our full motion video stack to just relieve a little bit of the burden off of the imagery analysts. From that, Project Maven was born. And Project Maven's writ, although it came out of USDINS, when signed out by then DepSecDef work, was this is where we're starting, but don't think of this just as an intel program. Think of this as a full, doctrinal warfighting, functions. Look at, is there a way that we can use data-driven technologies, artificial intelligence and machine learning to do our job better? As we started following that, we realized one of the areas that we had to get our head around was, first of all, the data. But you can't just talk to somebody about investing in data unless there's an outcome that it's going to drive. Otherwise, it's the KM of the past. It's data for data management. It's governance for governance purposes. But what we did with Project Maven, even 6 years ago, was begin this journey of getting data-driven technology in the hands of operators, and then letting those operators understand what they were doing with the technology, and then asking the question, if it can do that, can it do this? And then just continuing to evolve that software-driven capability to identify areas that we don't have the information technology stack right, areas that we don't have the transport right, or even areas that we don't have the policy right, so that when we confront something, we understand how to responsibly overcome it with a new policy, with the surgical precision to stay on that journey. Or, hey, this is one that we need to stop. We need to signal check with our commercial partners, with our international partners, because we've come across something that maybe has a bigger impact on more people than we realize. But ultimately, I'd say that in earnest, we started introducing artificial intelligence about 6 years ago due to great congressional support and senior-most Department of Defense leadership. We've stayed on this journey. We've continued the investment. And I think at this point we have probably over $4 billion in 6 years of learning reps in this campaign of learning to understand what works, what doesn't, and begin to present the future where we're going to drive this technology. I tell people, I was down at the 18th Airborne Corps some time ago, and the most exciting conversation I had was with a major from the Fire Support Office who wasn't talking about its ability to speed intel, but was talking about its ability to understand the backroom office functions, the log capabilities, the policy capabilities, the readiness capabilities. And when he could start bringing those into the battle space where we understand, yeah, I can make a decision to leverage this munition against this target with more precision than I've ever been able to do it before. But these are the impacts, and this is how long it will take for me to replenish those stocks. So if I'm making that decision, it was really exciting to see these young service members excited about being able to invent new warfighting concepts with data-driven technology that when you stack them in aggregate, begin to produce those doctrinal changes that we have individuals like Mike Horowitz and some of the team and your organization starting to police up into new ways of doing business in the department. I think the future's bright. It's always going to be messy, and we need to accept that is the thing.
Sure. I mean, it doesn't seem like we're going where it's going to stop. In fact, it's going to speed up. But since, not to get bogged down on this, but since you mentioned Project Maven, backstage we started an interesting conversation. There's a perception that technology companies, especially some like Google, resisted Project Maven, but you said there was a more complicated explanation of what's going on with what happened with Project Maven. I was wondering how much of that you could share, but also if you could address the sense out there that projects like this have gone forward, perhaps without the proper consideration of things like individual privacy, data scraping, and other concerns that I think you alluded to a little bit in your remarks about the unintended capabilities that were created.
I'm pretty sure I can't say off the record right now, so I'll just go and be careful with where I go. But no, I think every vendor that was contracted, at least during my time in the Department of Defense or in the intelligence community, made good on their commitments. More than that, I think we have learned a tremendous amount about what it takes to actually employ artificial intelligence live in your formation from these industry leaders. We wouldn't be where we are today if they didn't take the time to stop and help us understand, frankly, how hard some of the components and getting those components right are, so that we can do this persistently and have the dynamic retuning required to ensure that whatever algorithmic model we employ at whatever echelon continues to perform as expected in time and space, whether it's because of data poisoning, data drift, any of the things that could make this hard. We learned from industry how to do this, and we're continuing to learn from industry how to do this because, by the way, they're still experimenting themselves and figuring out with our commercial partners and our other national security partners how to get this done. I have not sensed, and I said this years ago even, anyone's unwillingness to work for the American people, the dream of democracy, whether that's here in the United States or with our allies and partners. I think everybody just has a different threshold about where they are in time and space and what they're willing to do, whether that's a lethal act, whether that's counter disinformation, or whether that's just, for our veterans in kind of a soldier to veteran journey that allows you to kind of pick those service members up and ensure we're taking as good of care on them in the backside as we should. I'll say that some of the vendor you mentioned already when I was down at U.S. Special Operations Command were helping us with traumatic brain injuries, how microconcussive events in aggregate could cause our special operators to struggle, and their ability to help us understand that. It might not be a lethal effect, within the rules of engagement, but it maybe is more important. So I think we've got a lot of opportunity to work with industry. I think we're continuing to learn from them, and I haven't sensed anybody really lack of willingness to go there when the call is made.
Interesting, thank you. Dr. Karlin, I want to ask you sort of, yes, we can understand that this is changing the back end, but let me ask you the same question I asked David about the kinetic capabilities in Ukraine. What are we learning about autonomous weapons, the speed of intelligence and targeting, the ability to do asymmetric kinetic operations against a larger dispersed force? What have you noticed about the use of AI and other advanced technologies on the ground in the battlefield in Ukraine that you might not have anticipated a year or two ago?
Yeah, absolutely. Dave had a really important phrase. He talked about a campaign of learning, right? And when you look at the history of military innovation, if it's done well, it is a campaign of learning, right? As capabilities shift, as your doctrine shifts, as your personnel and their understanding of how to use that technology shifts, that's all an incredibly dynamic thing. And we saw it with the railroad rifle and the telegraph, 150 years ago, and we're seeing it with AI today, right? This idea of data at scale, and in particular, there are things you will learn when you are not in the throes of a conflict, say through war games or tabletop exercises, and then there are other things that one inevitably will learn when there is a war fight going on. I mean, we saw this when our forces were in Iraq and Afghanistan, just how much innovation was happening because they were able to take certain things, put them out on the battlefield, and figure out how to make certain shifts and then apply them. And that kind of cycle is is so critical. So obviously, Ukraine is a laboratory of learning for military innovation. I think we've all seen no shortage of examples. In particular, I will say one that has struck me has been decision support. Which also probably sounds really wonky, right? So we've talked.
Explain what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, right, so we've talked about like Starlink, for example, right? Everyone has seen the impact of Starlink and what that has meant in terms of Ukraine's ability to fight against this terrible, unprovoked war of aggression launched by Vladimir Putin. Decision support, really the idea that you can take in a bunch of information and understand it, and then really make decisions in a kind of time and space of your choosing. And I really emphasize that point of your choosing, right? Because when you are in a war, to state the obvious, there's a whole lot of dynamism. Things are happening quickly. You want to make sure that you have got that advantage. And so the way in which AI and which data at scale has enabled, I think, a whole bunch of countries, obviously Ukraine, to be able to take actions when it needs to on the battlefield, but also, frankly, for all of us to be able to understand what's the state of the conflict. What are the sorts of things that Ukraine's military needs? You know, thanks to the incredible bipartisan support of Congress, we have raised historic amounts of assistance to Ukraine, as have, I think, 50 or so other countries with lethal aid. You only really know what to do if you understand what's happening on the ground. So again, this wonky idea of decision support, I think you can trace the impact it has had in Ukraine in this laboratory for how we are understanding the changing character of warfare. You can see that from a tactical level, an operational level, frankly, all the way to a strategic level.
Excellent. David, I came across an article on the Palantir website that was pointed out to me during our prep call for this event about acquisitions and technology. It was called the Valley of Death. It's not a very encouraging picture that painted about the flexibility and the agility of our system to acquire these kinds of capabilities. How's that going? What would you tell our government representatives here about what needs to be done in order to make sure that Valley of Death doesn't kill our ability to succeed and lead in these critical areas?
No, I appreciate that question. Actually, Dr. Karlin, I was telling her as I was coming in, I've only been out of government for about 14 months. And what I thought I knew, now I'm fascinated by the learning opportunity. To the point on stealing people's taglines, actually the campaign of learning I stole from Secretary Hicks. So if you could just let her, I
100%.
gave her the acknowledgement there. Because she was very, very clear on the importance of that, and some of the initiatives that she's undertaken and started really were to just blow nitrous into some of those events and really allow us to expand that. And from this side, it's fun to watch it actually take off. As that applies to the Valley of Death, I think, what it really comes down to, I don't want to talk about, the acquisition process is too slow. I've sat at plenty of these events where all we do is we talk about the poor acquisition process. What I can tell you, the last several jobs I had in the department, I'd go to the Hill, and I can't tell you how many staffers, how many representatives or senators said, "What do you need, Dave? What do you need? We'll give you new authorities." And by the end of it, I said, "I think I have all the authorities I need." We have some very progressive acquisition authorities. What we don't have is a budgetary system that allows us to think like venture capitalists, to have a new asset class that allows us to make bets and take bets at the speed that the commercial sector can. And I think that's somewhere that I know we're talking about how the budgetary process works, how the finance works. But frankly, the representative isn't here today because he's trying to help us maybe get to another CR. I can't tell you how that negatively impacts the department's ability to actually recognize some of the initiatives that they've started and ensure that there's a clean funding line for 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 years to bring them into reality. Those hiccups hurt. And then the next thing you know, what we default to spend the budget is a lot of things we paid for yesteryear, and we're not actually optimizing based on some of the decisions that I've made. What I can tell you is the Valley of Death is real for small companies. I think if we fix the budgetary process, there's going to be opportunities for it. What I can say, working with Palantir, is one of the areas I've been the most excited about is their FedStart program, where we have recognized that somebody needs to build the ecosystem. So how can we help small companies that would normally take somewhere between 18 and 36 months to get their software onto a classified network and spend millions upon millions of dollars to do that. How can we expedite that? How can we, who have a lot of scar tissue for how hard this was, it wasn't that long ago that we weren't just like them, how can we help build that ecosystem? Because if we don't, who's going to? And so it's exciting to see some of these small companies begin to come in, find their place, and begin to recognize that success and kind of maybe flatten the valley a little bit.
We'll get a clip of this session and send it to Congressman Waltz so that he can
Thank you very much.
hear those very important calls for more budgetary sanity after he gets done saving the budget, hopefully. Let's talk about China. First to you, Dr. Karlin. I'm reading now from the DoD's latest military report on China. It says that the People's Liberation Army has intelligized warfare with a new operating concept called multi-domain precision warfare, which it describes as, quote, network information system of systems that incorporates advances in big data and AI to rapidly identify key vulnerabilities in the U.S. operational system and then combine joint forces across domains to launch precision strikes against those vulnerabilities. That sounds pretty ominous, okay? So first of all, what are we doing about that? And second of all, do we have anything like that?
So look, we have a couple things that are pretty notable. And before I get into sort of the Department of Defense answer, I want to start with just a United States of America answer. And I think it's particularly appropriate given that we are sitting here at the Reagan Institute, right? A period of time in which we saw substantial investment in the U.S. Department of Defense, but not just in buying whiz-bang gizmos, right? It was investment in research and development. It was research in science and technology, and that was across the U.S. ecosystem. And I think the dividends of what we saw through the investments in President Reagan's administration, we have continued to see for decades and decades. And I just want to highlight that because at that moment, in a very different set of circumstances, the United States was also dealing with a pretty big challenge on the other side of the world, right? But American ingenuity bore fruit, and that has been really meaningful. So let me now focus on the Department of Defense piece. First of all, we have a really good strategy. Again, that national defense strategy, it is very clear on what the focus is. The need to focus on the People's Republic of China. I'm actually not sure the last time we had a national defense strategy that was as focused for a whole bunch of different reasons, to be very clear, given kind of shifting security environments, et cetera. But at this moment in time, there is widespread agreement, and I would say actually bipartisan agreement on the whole when we talk to our colleagues on Capitol Hill as well about this need to focus on the People's Republic of China as the pacing challenge. That's really because we don't see any other country with the intent and increasingly the capability to try to reshape the global security order. And I think you've talked a little bit about what that might look like. So what do we do about that? What we do in addition to focusing is we have a concept known as integrated deterrence. And it means that inside the Department of Defense, across the interagency, and with that unparalleled network of allies and partners, we are making sure that we are all swimming together to focus on deterrence and, if needed, being able to prevail in conflict. So that means the Department of Defense is working across domains. And I think that that was a piece of what you were highlighting, in particular from our colleagues over in Beijing, looking across domains. Now, it is really easy for us to think about the changing character of warfare and just think about the domains we're comfortable, right? Land, maritime, air, we all kind of get that. And yet that is simply not the complete picture. We have got to include cyber. We have got to include space. We've got to have that cross-domain perspective in terms of how we understand the challenge base and how we understand our toolkit. We've also got to be able to do that across theaters because we are, of course, looking globally, and I would underscore across the spectrum of conflict, right? We have capabilities that go all the way from one end of the spectrum of conflict to the other. Let's be cognizant of that. Let's invest in that and modernize that. Now, outside of the Department of Defense, we've got a very capable U.S. interagency. I think we have watched the effectiveness of that whole of government response in the case of responding to Russia's terrible war on Ukraine. We've also seen it, frankly, in the case of dealing with the People's Republic of China as well. And here I would say, wide aperture, whole of government, look at the great things that our Congress did, say, with passing the CHIPS Act, and just the incredible impact that that will have as well. And then finally, those allies and partners. Do not underestimate the significance of those allies and partners and the tremendous investments that they are making in their own defense budgets. If you want to take some spectacular case studies, go look at Japan, for example. Go look at Australia. Really notable cases. Look at what various countries are doing to invest in their own posture and in enabling our posture so that we can be forward and be able to deal with challenges overseas, and look at the contributions that we can make together. So what you're hearing from me is our approach is really a holistic one that is taking into account the changing character of warfare and is very seriously prioritized, because we see what the challenge space looks like and we know that we've got to focus on that. And frankly, to the extent that the we includes the entire United States of America and our allies and partners, I feel pretty good about how that's going to turn out.
Okay, well, I totally understand. That's a clear and optimistic analysis. But let me ask you, David, for the industry perspective, and now I'm quoting from the National Security Commission on AI from 2021 that was led by Eric Schmidt and Bob Work. They had a less optimistic analysis of how we're faring vis-a-vis China. This is a quote: "China possesses the might, talent, and ambition to surpass the United States as the world's leader in AI in the next decade if current trends do not change. Simultaneously, AI is deepening the threat posed by cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns from Russia, China, and others are using to infiltrate our society, steal our data, and interfere in our democracy." They're calling for not just a whole of government, but a whole of society mobilization on AI. It seems to me that we have certain advantages. The authoritarian states have certain other advantages regarding data, civil-military fusion, the ability to direct resources without pesky budgeting problems or elections. From your perspective, do you think that Schmidt and Work are right that if we don't change what we're doing, that China will surpass us in AI?
I think it's a complicated question. I'd start out maybe the Marine in me, quoting General Mattis, which said, "I'm happy to get in a fight with somebody who's never been punched in the face before." We have real-world reps. We have real-world data sets. We have partners and allies who will show up for that match with us. I think that is a hugely undervalued competitive advantage. Now, do I think we're moving as fast as we could? No. I think we should be integrating more of these data-driven technologies just for the campaign of learning opportunity it presents. But I do believe that's a little bit of a bleak assessment compared to what I at least personally have watched since 2021. The department and the national security sector writ large, including commercial industry, begin to bring into the fight. Things don't happen overnight. Getting the data right so that you can do this, having the other components in place that allow you to understand how you prioritize, what you prioritize, and where, isn't something that comes out of a laboratory and is just delivered into the warfighting element. I think there's components of our own talent in the formation that we need to better understand its ability to see a data-driven technology, understand the basic components of how that works, begin to integrate it, and then get better with every new rep as they move up in the stack themselves. I think that talent, not tools component is understated, but what I can tell you is where we started 6 years ago, integrating the data-driven technologies in the soft formation, watching the then operational echelon leaders and the service members around those projects, and watching where we have fires sparking and new imaginative ways of using this data-driven technology. You can almost trace the lineage back to where we started 6 years ago, 7 years ago, and now it's blossoming throughout. So one of the things I'm the most excited about is this the current senior-most leadership in the department's ability to fan those flames, to make investments with things like the AI and Data Accelerator Initiative into the combatant commands, to subsidize the delivery of a capability so that we can begin doing AI-enabled mission command, that decision advantage that Dr. Karlin spoke about. If you go all the way back to the old data strategy, which was the first data strategy, it's only like 3 years old now, so it's scary to say it's old. But we prioritized three things when we first rewrote that article, because the first time it landed on my desk, I read it and I took it back and I said, then CIO and DepSecDef, this reads like some data professional wrote it. The air up here is very refined. All you troglodytes who can't speak AI, learn to speak like me. It was horrible. There was not going to be one operator or senior decision maker who could read that document and understand what it was prioritizing and why. So we went back on a massive rewrite to the point of we didn't do it in isolation. We both brought in our military departments, the services, and the Five Eye data leaders to help us understand, are we writing something that's going to go sideways from what you're working on, because we need to put the warfighter at the center of this. And then once we've given that cardinal direction, right, we'll have an opportunity to go help people implement and expedite their way to that success. So I think as complex as it is for us, it's as complex for our competitors as well. I think we have an advantage, which is our Silicon Valley partners, our commercial partners, are national security jewels. Their willingness to participate with us in this journey, make investments maybe before there's a contract, it's real. And I think when we bring all that together, if you go back and read a book called Freedom's Forge, which talked about how we organized for World War II, I think we're probably beginning to see the semblance of how that commercial sector is again working with our national security leaders to lean into that concept so that we're ready.
Josh, can I hook onto something you just asked Dave as
Sure.
well, if you don't mind?
Absolutely.
So you mentioned disinformation, and I think it's worth remembering that when we all were sitting here 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there was this romanticization of authoritarianism as it relates to disinformation, right? They're so good at it, our democracy just can't thrive in dealing with disinformation. And I think actually we've seen recent case studies that show it turns out democracies can do this really well, right? It's hard, but we can try and we can succeed. And obviously, I think the spectacular example is in the run-up and throughout Russia's terrible war on Ukraine, where we were able, by releasing information to allies and partners and then to the American public, make it very clear, here's what was happening at the moments where we saw the Russians wanting to sow disinformation into the system. We've been able to get ahead of it. And I just want to highlight that because it's a little bit different than I think a lot of folks might have thought even a few years ago. And so it does paint a story that democracies can succeed in these spaces, even when sometimes it feels like perhaps our bureaucracies are making it challenging.
Yeah, I think that, thank you for that additional point. I think, not to editorialize, that there have been some instances of progress. At the same time, if you look at my TikTok feed, you'll see very clearly that we have a long way to go in fighting authoritarian disinformation. Or maybe that's just my algorithm, but
It could be that you're using TikTok.
yes.
What are you putting on your TikTok?
It's all sort of Chinese and Russian propaganda. Maybe it's just me, but it seems like that disinformation threat is morphing, and that, at least in that sense, we're failing
to your point, the
combat
arrival,
it,
the arrival of generative AI, the arrival of large language models, and our ability to create things that didn't exist. I mean, but it's going to be a cat and mouse game.
Sure.
Just like any technology that arrives, as an important component of the national security sector, whether it's cyber, whether it's nuclear, whatever it is, there's always going to be that cat and mouse chasing. And so I think we just need to be realistic about that's what's going to happen on the AI front.
A lot of cats on my TikTok feed as well, but that's not related to what we're talking about here. Let's go to questions. Please raise your hand. Tell us who you are, if you have an affiliation, and if you have a comment, please put it into the form of a question, and we'll start right over here. Wait for the mic, please. Thank you. Sorry.
Melanie Marlowe, CSIS. Thank you for being here. Dr. Karlin, you mentioned at the beginning the national security strategies, which, as you said several times, talk about leveraging our partners and allies, and the administration, I want to compliment, has done a fantastic job on that with Ukraine. However, you also mentioned AUKUS, and you mentioned Australia again specifically, and we are heading into the second year of AUKUS and looking at Pillar 2, all of those very important technologies that you mentioned, that Dr. Hsu is constantly discussing. We are having real problems with ITAR reform, and we cannot leverage our allies in the ways that we need to for deterrence and, as you said, in the case of combat, unless we have ITAR reform. Mid-sized companies cannot afford the lawyers. They don't want to get into that. Barely big companies want to get into that. But I was in Australia, and every meeting I had, people are they need ITAR reform so that we can share those technologies as the defense strategies say, so that we can share technology and co-produce and do all of those things will be so essential.
Got it. Thank you very much. Just in case there's someone who doesn't know what ITAR is, could you?
It's
Yeah.
the International Trafficking in Arms Regulations.
Okay.
We don't want to
Yep.
be giving all this information.
That's all. I knew that. I knew that.
I know you know.
Yeah.
All right.
If we're having you look Australia,
Yeah, we got it.
should we fix that?
Understood.
Yeah.
Dr. Karlin, that's definitely for you.
Absolutely. No, I'm delighted that you raised this point. The National Defense Strategy talks about allies and partners as being a center of gravity. We have this unparalleled network. We want to take advantage of it. Moreover, we all know that a lot of pieces of this system that you are highlighting, they were designed for a different era, right? They were designed for an era where it was really the United States that had the military technology superiority, and we weren't necessarily learning as much, shall we say, from others. That landscape has changed. That ecosystem looks different. And because it looks different, it means we are going to be learning a lot as much as we are going to be sharing with our allies and partners. So it is actually very much in our interest to make all of this easier. It is in our national security interest. And AUKUS is the perfect example here, right? We have two countries who've stood shoulder to shoulder with us for 70 years or so, right? It's really hard to look back at a war we have fought over the last 70 years and not see Australia and the United Kingdom there with us. They see the global security landscape very, very similarly to us. And in particular, I should note, they see Indo-Pacific security and stability as critical and important. They have systems that look quite similar to ours. So our capabilities are the same. Our intentions are quite similar as well. So what do we do about this? And so what we actually have done is we have been working with our colleagues on Capitol Hill to look at how to reform our export control system so that we really can find a way to enable great things like AUKUS, right? Enable bilateral defense trade to go as smoothly as possible so that not just our ministries / departments of defense can work together really well, but also our defense industry, because we want to inculcate that innovation and that collaboration among all three allies' defense industry. So we are working really hard on that. I had the opportunity to testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on this topic about 2 weeks or so ago. And I would say, on the whole, I've been heartened to see how many of our colleagues on Capitol Hill just recognize the criticality of being able to see how we can plant these seeds of innovation with two of our very closest allies and allow them to grow so well. So for AUKUS Pillar 2, which really means collaborating on advanced capabilities with the United Kingdom and Australia, for that to really become a reality and to kind of meet these grandiose ambitions we have of a generational, of a kind of a generational shifting concept, we are going to have export control reform as a reality.
And another thing we'll put on the list of things to send to Mike Waltz when he emerges. Right here, sir.
Phil Stewart from Reuters. Just real quick, if China were to leapfrog the United States in AI and quantum computing, how long do you think it would take for the U.S. to figure that out? And also, are you more sympathetic or worried by people who ask whether AI could pose an existential threat to humanity? And then for David Spirk, could you talk a little bit about whether the department is good at harnessing all the data that it collects and feeding that into AI, whether that's a place where things could be.
Look, I know we are on a panel on artificial intelligence, so the right answer is probably that artificial intelligence is the sine qua non of all things that we do in this world. But of course, we know that that's just not accurate, right? That is incomplete. So I wouldn't want to just look at one tool or one platform or one capability, or even the notion of data at scale, as we see with artificial intelligence, and say that that will be the thing that decides what exactly the future looks like. It will be a very important component, to be sure, but I think that this idea of who exactly is going to be where is probably going to be too simplistic, right? It's going to depend on the tools you have, it's going to depend on the talent you have, and it's going to depend on the policies and the processes that you have as well to make it a reality. And so this notion that you are walking to, I think, of, how might one think of this, of AI being an existential threat, it will all come down to how and in what ways we will use different tools. And to the extent that we, the United States, can work among ourselves and also with our allies and partners to encourage that responsible use, I think we'll actually have much better, broader results for global security.
Yeah, I'll dovetail into a bit of that answer, which is AI is not invented in a dark room somewhere with nobody knowing that it's under development. This is a very open development, amongst not just a handful, but now thousands upon thousands of individuals who are creating in real time, posting on GitHub. There's academic papers about it. I don't think there's going to be a moment of artificial intelligence surprise that we might have had with, say, a nuclear weapon that immediately emerged. And even there was a race. There was, technology exchanges in the form of espionage, probably. But, I don't think we have that same worry with AI. Quantum, I think, is an area that we could find some strategic surprise. I believe that when you start to look at AI as a commodity, but you look at the components that allow you to bring AI together in time and space, again, you go back to very basic things about compute, about transport, and to your earlier question about data and data availability and the repeatability of creating those workflows that allow those workflows to be trusted and something you can count on. I think we still don't know exactly the end where quantum is. I don't think we're a year away from quantum surprise, but I do think we need to continuously make significant investments in that space at a national level, because when you start talking about the motor that's going to power your AI software, that could be a game changer. As far as the data goes, to your question, I think the important component there is back in May of 21, Secretary Hicks signed out the department's first data decrees, hearkening back to Jeff Bezos when he, signed out his in 2001, 2002 timeframe. What that really signaled was we're moving to an open data standard architecture. It planted the flag that said we're going this direction, that there's two data owners in the Department of Defense. One is named Secretary Austin, the other is Deputy Secretary of Defense Hicks. Everybody else is a custodian or a steward. And the Chief Data Office, now the CDAO, are going to be responsible for unlocking those data sets. And if you have a legacy system that can't, be it a technology, issue or a resource issue, come to that standard, eventually we're going to start working with CAPE, Susanna Bloom and her team, and we're going to begin identifying those to sunset, because you're not going to be a part of the future in the Department of Defense. It's been exciting to watch the commercial sector turn to that capability to say, okay, no more bespoke, can't lock my data down, can't write a contract that tricks anybody, because now there's smart data people on the contracting side too. And so you're not going to hold us hostage. So I don't think we're all the way there. I think we have a lot of work to do. But I do believe that the policy and guidance documents are out, that we're watching the operational campaign of learning in both the battle space, whether it's the 18th Airborne Corps, whether it's CENTCOM, whether it's Indo-PACOM, wherever that might be. And we're seeing the boardroom side with just some of the initiatives that are exciting to watch OSD do themselves, so they can start leveraging that decision advantage in how we run the Pentagon. I think we're prioritized. I think we're moving the right direction. Again, I think we should move faster, and I think that's what gives us our competitive edge against China, is if we can.
Excellent. I'd like, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. As we move to dinner, what I'm sure will be a continuing, interesting, robust debate over a delicious meal, I'd like to leave you all with this quote from the late Stephen Hawking. Success in creating AI would be the biggest event in human history. Unfortunately, it might also be the last, unless we learn how to avoid the risks. It is with that both optimism and dread that I take away from this conversation that we've had here today. And thank you for enlightening us, and thank you for your service. And please give our panelists a round of applause.